What if the price of your house tripled, quadrupled, or even trigontupled? We're about to count down the top 5 biggest house price booms in history, including what caused each boom, how much house prices skyrocketed, and what happens when it all comes crashing down. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. I'm Ed, an economist and property investor at Opes Partners, and make sure you stick around for the largest housing boom in history, which turned a fishing village into a global tech megacity. But first, the 5th largest housing boom in history was in Spain. You see, back in the late 90s, the Spanish housing market, it looked unstoppable. In the 10 years from 1997 to 2007, house prices went up 197%. That's right, they tripled, and it was one of Europe's biggest modern booms. Now, what triggered it? First, money got cheaper. As Spain joined the Eurozone, interest rates fell, and they stayed low through to the mid-2000s. Cheaper interest rates, well, that makes it cheaper for people to borrow money and then bid up the price of a house. People did that, and the cost of housing shot up before it all went wrong. You see, house prices, they got too expensive, at least compared to incomes, and the number of new houses getting built, it soared from just under 250,000 per year all the way up to 650,000 per year. So not only did house prices overheat, but all of that supply coming onto the market, it just meant that that boom was unsustainable. Now, in the aftermath, Spanish house prices fell 45% from that 2007 peak through to the trough 6 years later. It in fact got so bad that we started hearing about ghost towns like in Shenzhen near Madrid. A development was left half built and half empty for over a decade. But although the Spanish house price boom was monumental, the 4th largest house price boom in history was in fact even bigger. And if you study these housing booms and can spot what causes them and what eventually makes the bubble burst, you're much more likely to be able to spot these for yourself in whichever country you live in, which is why you should download this free cheat sheet that shows you the key signs I've learned from studying each of these housing booms. I'll drop the link down in the description. The 4th biggest boom happened around the same time as in Spain, because between 1996 and 2006, official figures show that Irish house prices were up about 270%, which means they nearly quadrupled in just a decade. Again, it was the smell of sweet, cheap European cash that kicked it all off. The lending tap turned on, and it got the Irish buying houses. In fact, Irish house prices, they didn't just rise. They took flight. The average cost of a house went from 75,000 euros to 280,000 euros in just that decade. But there's one key difference with Spain that made Irish house prices go up even faster. Around the same time, the Celtic tiger economy was it was roaring. There were plenty of jobs, incomes were rising, the population, everything was trending up. And that cocktail of strong housing demand, cheaper money, and confidence, that's what pushed house prices up higher and faster than most of us have ever or will ever see. But the lending tap stayed on longer than it should have. House prices, they outpaced incomes, they outpaced rents. And there was a building boom that eventually brought more of that supply onto the market. And over the next 5 years, Irish house prices fell by 56%. Remember that house I was talking about that was worth 280,000 euros? It's now worth only 123,000 euros at the bottom of the market. And the classic lesson you need to learn is that housing booms don't end when people get nervous. They end when the money does. And we see that again in the 3rd largest housing boom in history. Hong Kong house prices have been on a wild ride. They in fact dropped 61% between 1997 through to 2003, like over 6 years. But once that downturn was over, another boom got going. But this time, it wasn't European cash that pumped up house prices. This time, it was down to the Americans, because Hong Kong imports US interest rates through its currency peg. Basically, the Hong Kong dollar has been tied to the greenback since 1983, which basically means that when interest rates in the States go down, they go down in Hong Kong too. And during the GFC, the United States dropped their interest rates hard. That's part of the reason why between 2003 and 2018, Hong Kong house prices went up 341%. That's what happens when cheap US money meets tight land supply in Hong Kong, and the real estate market went mental. Developers were launching apartment towers that sold out within hours. Real estate agents, they actually ran lotteries for slots to even view properties. And people stretched themselves, taking on bigger and bigger loans and mortgages because the monthly payments, they still looked doable at those low interest rates. But although cheap interest rates seem to almost always kick off a housing boom, there's another reason that Hong Kong house prices just shot up. And it all comes down to the land. Hong Kong is built on a few islands and peninsulas. It's fenced in between the sea and mountains, and there isn't that much land available to build houses. And then you've got the really strong household incomes there, and all of that together pushed up house prices higher and higher, and then the music stopped. Interest rates went up, and a slower Chinese economy knocked the wind out of the sails of the housing market. And around 5 years later, Hong Kong house prices were down about 30% from their 2021 peak. And just before we start counting down the top 2 housing booms in history, you might have noticed that so far all 3 of the booms we've discussed happened just within the last few decades. And you might wonder, well, what is it about that specific time that pushed house prices up? Well, some of it was what was happening in the global economy at the time. Money got cheaper and the banks deregulated and started lending out more and more money. Homes stopped being just somewhere to live and started being seen as an asset class in itself. Spain, Ireland, Hong Kong, they're all totally different places, but they all saw property house price booms with the same or similar ingredients. But there's something else going on too. We actually only started getting good house price data from about the 1960s and 70s onwards. So it's not just that we got a few big housing booms in the 90s, which we absolutely did, but these were some of the first house price booms that we actually took the time to measure. I mean, I found this property boom in southern Florida from the mid-1920s. Property prices there went vertical in months, not years. In fact, the University of Miami said that properties that normally sold for around $2,000 flipped for $50,000. That is an insane 2,400% leap. And while we've got anecdotal evidence in a few old newspapers to show that property prices really did go off like a frog in a sock, we don't have reliable modern data to prove that was actually the case like we do today. So even though there have been massive property price booms for centuries, a lot of the big booms from a long time ago, well, we just can't get the numbers to measure them like we can today, which is why most of the big property booms appear to have happened in the last 30 to 40 years. Now, I can't believe this is only the second largest house price boom in history, because in less than 4 decades, house prices in Japan went up 86 times. It's one of the steepest, most sustained land price climbs ever recorded in a major economy. Now, what set this all in motion? Well, the first reason is that post-war Japan was an absolute growth miracle. The factories roared, wages climbed, people started moving to the cities, and that concentrated both Japan's population, but also their disposable income into a few large cities. Now that increased housing demand in those areas which were already really populous. And like in almost every other house price boom ever, interest rates fell. Cheap money poured in from banks and they put it into the asset that they often trust the most, land. And when the price of land goes up, you can borrow more against that piece of land. And that means that you can take that money and buy, you got it, more land, and that feeds into this ongoing cycle. Now, by the late 1980s, Tokyo real estate had gone from already expensive to mythical. The famous, if debated, cocktail party stat from the time was that the ground underneath the Imperial Palace was said to be worth more than all of the real estate in California combined. So what's the Bank of Japan to do? Well, they raised interest rates, which meant buyers struggled to afford their mortgages, and property prices, they dropped like a stone. For more than a decade, land values drifted down by around 70% through the 1990s and early 2000s. Now, in most housing busts, prices fall hard and then they slowly claw their way back. But Japanese house prices didn't bounce back. They sank slowly for years, and property prices today in Japan, at least at the national level, are still yet to recover. But the largest house price boom in the history of the world was in a city you might never have heard of. And if you've already downloaded my cheat sheet that helps you spot the next housing boom and bust, You might already know the answer to this, because this little fishing village in China became a megacity home to companies like Huawei, Tencent, and the electric car maker BYD, and it's Shenzhen. Now, back in 2004, a young man named Jackie Su moved to Shenzhen as a teenager. His family bought a pretty ordinary apartment in a non-central suburb. Now, it felt expensive back then at roughly about 4,000 yuan per square metre, but fast forward 17 years, in 2021, that exact same apartment was going for nearly 80,000 yuan per square metre, about a 20-fold increase. And if you compare the same number of years and decades, Shenzhen's property boom outpaced even Japan's insane house price boom. Funnily enough, a few years later, Jackie would move to New Zealand and become a researcher, helping me research and run the numbers on these YouTube videos. And through that study, through that research, we found that unlike the house and property price booms that were fueled by interest rate cuts, in Shenzhen, it was government policy that was the rocket fuel. You see, it was one of China's first special economic zones that were part of the country's reform and opening up policy. Foreign investment, it poured in, and the locals now had the freedom to experiment with the free market. The city's slogan was literally, "Time is money, efficiency is life." And Shenzhen's population exploded. It went from a small township in 1979 to a mega city of 18 million people. But can the locals still afford houses? Well, only a few can. Even after a pullback where property prices dropped from their 2021 peak, the average house still reportedly costs 38.4 times the average income. Now, like most housing markets, property prices have cooled since their peak. They're down about 40% since 2021. But why did Shenzhen's property boom finally run out of steam? What's the lesson? Well, when governments make borrowing cheaper and banks start doling out mortgages to anyone with a pulse, you already know that a massive boom could be on the way. But remember, every boom has a bust on the other side. And in the next video, I'll take you through the biggest housing crashes in history. Click here to keep watching, and I'll show you what happens when the music stops.